What would you do if you could go back in time, right? To know what you know now and transport yourself back in time, what would you do with that opportunity, with the knowledge you have, the power that that might bring? Now, I mean, there's a lot of movies about going back in time. There's some of the basic rules, right? You're not supposed to meet yourself in another time dimension. That's like rule number one, I think. Some of the movies you watch, you're not supposed to change anything because, a minor change could have a massive repercussion in today's world. But we all know we would change something, right? I mean, we all think, well, the thing I would change, that would actually make the world better, not worse. It wouldn't, cause, nuclear war or outbreak or whatever. I don't know. In Back to the Future 2, you remember the character Biff. He was kind of the nemesis character. He brought back a copy of a sports almanac back into the past, and he was able to make, untold wealth because he could bet accurately on all of the games. He knew the outcome. He became a rich man from that. So what would you do if you could go back? Or we could flip the question around, right? What if you knew the future? It's the same thing, like the future to current is what the current is to the past. So it's the same thing. If you go back in time, or if you could know the future, it's kind of the same thing. Knowing the future changes how you act now, right? I mean, if you knew you could buy a plot of land that had billions of dollars of oil under it, that would change what you would do this afternoon, probably. You could go buy that plot of land, right? This is what, in the days of westward expansion, in the Old West, this is what land speculators did. They tried to gauge where was the railroad going to go and buy up that land in advance. And for some people, man, that paid out huge. If the railroad went through, if it bought your town, if it bought your land to put a town and the railroad through, you were doing great. For a lot of people, though, if you called it wrong and the railroad didn't go through that plot of land, you wound up just owning land that wouldn't become valuable for a generation, perhaps generations, perhaps still is not very valuable. You don't know. Knowing the future changes how you act. This morning, we're going to be in Matthew chapter 24, and Jesus is entering his final discourse in Matthew. There's been 5 discourses throughout the book. This is number 5. And in it, he reveals a lot of things about the future, and he expects us to behave differently because of this. He's going to make that explicitly clear that based on what he's telling us, we should be ordering our lives in a different way around that. This is known as the Olivet Discourse. So join me, plug your flex capacitors in, and let's get going. So he starts out with 2 questions from his disciples, 24 verse 1. It says, Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. But he answered them, you see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. The past couple of chapters, he's been in the temple complex. So he came to Jerusalem, starts on the Mount of Olives, he's peering in, he goes into the Temple Mount, and then he starts this back and forth dialogue with the Pharisees, which ended with the previous chapter where he pronounced some pretty serious woes against the Pharisees. And so now he's finally concluded that conversation and he's left Jerusalem and he's back on the Mount of Olives. And so Jerusalem sits on this hill. It's really beautiful, and I can imagine back in the day it would have been amazing to actually see the temple there. It would have been gilded in gold, and just the city would have kind of stood by itself. And so coming from the laid-back environment of Galilee, for the disciples, this must have been like a pretty big deal. If you've ever seen tourists in New York City, you can always spot the tourists in New York City because they're the ones doing this, right? It's kind of like tourists out here. Like they look up at all the trees and they just kind of wander around looking like that. That's what the disciples were doing. They're leaving Jerusalem and they're looking back and they're just saying, wow, look at all of this. Isn't it great? And Jesus says that not one stone is going to be left on another. That's a bold claim. I mean, considering what it would take. If you ever get a chance to go and you can see these blocks that weigh as much as an airplane, right? That they moved into place, and to think someone is going to physically remove those piece by piece. But that's exactly what happened. In AD 70, when the Romans came through, they took all of the stones down, they cast them off of the hill there, and they were scraping the gold off of the rocks. They wanted all of the gold that Solomon had overlaid on the stones. In verse 3, he goes on to say, as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately saying, tell us, when will these things be, and what will the sign of your coming be and of the end of the age? When will these things be? And what's the signs of this time? Jesus, he's back on the Mount of Olives, and this is an area I mentioned a couple weeks ago that's very pregnant with meaning about the end times. Zechariah 14:4 has a prophecy about this. He says, on that day, his feet shall stand on the Mount of Olives that lies before Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall be split in two from east to west by a very wide valley, so that one half of the mount shall move northward and the other half southward. When the Messiah comes back, he's going to step on the mountain, split the mountain in half. So this is a very clear prophecy. This is where they're sitting, having a discussion where Jesus has just said something bad's going to happen to the temple. And now they come up with actually a very logical question. Tell us, when are these things going to happen? What are the signs? Those are two questions. When and what are the signs? These two chapters, chapter 24 and 25, they kind of go together. Now, these are not clear, simple passages, as you're going to see as we read through the text today and the next couple of weeks. These are hotly contested, they're hotly debated, they're filled with problematic sayings. And so I don't want to make it sound like it's simple, but basically, he's answering these two questions, the when and the what. In the next chapter, he tells three stories that's going to apply these, that's going to apply the lessons from chapter 24. It's going to apply them in practical ways. How should we live differently? So those three stories in chapter 25 are connected here. But Jesus deals with the second question first. What are the signs? I'm going to deal with that today. Next Sunday, we have a special guest. Ken Draper is going to be presenting about kind of the middle portion of this chapter, which actually gets into the first question, which is, when is it going to happen? He has all of the answers. He's going to settle every single debate. And if he doesn't do that for you, he's just holding out, and I don't know why he would hold out like that. No, I appreciate him coming. I'll be the first to say, I don't know, which I'm in line with the text, which says no one knows the day or the hour. So I'm glad I don't have to preach next week. Best of luck, Ken. As we go through the seven signs of the end, it's important to note that later in the chapter, Jesus says something this is one of those problematic statements. In verse 34, he says, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all of these things have taken place. Now, that for us as modern readers, that kind of presents a challenge of going, okay, well, some of these things seem to be historic. Some of these things for us still seem to be future. How did that generation not pass away and yet the end has not come? And so again, it's not an easy passage to kind of unwrap all of the layers. But with that verse in mind, with each of the 7 points this morning, I'm going to try to show how is this fulfilled in the first century. I also want to show how is this still an issue today. So a lot of these things relate to what was happening with the Romans at the time, but I think in our own age, there's still kind of signs that are letting us know that that Jesus is coming is soon. So let's continue reading. Verse 4, it says, and Jesus answered them, see that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See to it that you are not alarmed. For this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All of these are but the beginning of the birth pains. And they will deliver you to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. I want to kind of break those down kind of phrase by phrase. Sign number one is the presence of false messiahs. Many will come in my name saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. He opens with, I don't want you to be led astray. And here are the people who are going to come and try to lead you astray. In the first century, there was a guy named Theudas. Theudas is actually talked about in the book of Acts. Acts 5:36 says, for before these days, Theudas rose up, claiming to be somebody. And a number of men, about 400, joined him. He was killed, and all who followed him were dispersed and came to nothing. It's not just Acts that talks about Theudas. Actually, Josephus, an early historian, talks about this same character. Here's what Josephus says. Not the scriptures, by the way, just a historian. It says, now it came to pass, while Theudas was procurator of Judea, that a certain magician whose name was Theudas persuaded a great part of the people to take their effects with them and follow him to the river Jordan. For he told them he was a prophet, and that he would by his own command divide the river and afford them passage over it. And many were deluded by his words. However, Theudas did not permit them to take any advantage of his wild attempt, but But he sent a troop of horsemen out against them, who falling upon them unexpectedly, slew many of them and took many alive. They also took Theudas alive and cut off his head and carried it to Jerusalem. So in the first century already, within a few years of the life of Christ, there's someone claiming, hey, I'm Christ. Let's go down to the Jordan. I'm going to perform some miracles for you. And obviously he did not pan out on his expectations that they had for him. But in modern times, there have been all kinds of wild claims to messiahship. There have been 6 Jewish claims to messiahship starting at about 50 AD. The most recent one was in the early 90s. There's been 19 claims to messiahship from Christian, use air quotes on purpose, from Christian leaders. There have been 2 from Muslim backgrounds, 1 from Baha'i backgrounds, and 1 from a Zoroastrian background. If you want to see a full list of this, which is not like an officially full list, just get on Wikipedia later and look up Messianic claimants, and they'll have a whole list of all these different characters. But Jesus is warning us in advance so that we're not fooled by these claims. When the real Messiah comes back, there's not going to be any mistaking it. Right? Go read Revelation, read the other places that talk about the end time. It's going to be very, very clear. If you're sitting there wondering, I wonder if this person might be the Messiah, his second coming. If you're having to ask, if you're having to wonder, then the answer is no. Because it's going to be very clear what is going to be happening. There's not going to be any wondering, is this local person that you know the real Messiah or not? Sign number 2, wars and rumors of wars. Verse 6, you will hear wars and rumors of wars. See to it that you're not alarmed. This must take place, but the end is not yet. Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. In the first century, there was a war that started where the Jews rose up again, kind of like they did in the days of the Maccabees. This was about 66 AD. And this was the result of growing hostility from a group of Jews who were called the Zealots. Remember, amongst Jesus' disciples, he had one who was a zealot. They did not like the Romans, and they were willing to go to swords over not liking the Romans. And at this point, the Romans had actually gone down into Israel in a much bigger way. They actually had forces down there at this time. And so the zealots finally have like a real army to fight, and they're excited about this. Most of the people in the city are terrified, but they are very, very excited because in their mind, if we go to open conflict, if we go to swords with the Romans, this is the moment when God is going to come in and fight our battles, right? In the back of their mind, you can see them playing the greatest hits from like the book of Joshua, right? You know, they like the army, the choir shows up and marches around Jericho and they blow the horns and it falls. Or Gideon, you know, the torches and the trumpets and the army scatters and fights itself. Or the scenes where like the hornets are fighting or the rocks are falling. I mean, that's what they're envisioning in their mind is if we just have the faith to throw the doors open, per se, and go out and fight an open conflict, that's when God's going to show up and fight our battles. To help motivate the entire city to do this, they took the food supply and they torched it, right? It's a whole lot easier to get people to move outside the walls if there's nothing to eat inside. And so essentially this whole action by their part, led to the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, and it incited the end of first century Israel as we would know it from Bible times. In modern times, though, armed conflicts are definitely on the rise. They're the highest right now than they have been since World War II. The number of current conflicts have doubled in the last 5 years, and analysts say that there's roughly 60 countries in the world that are having open conflicts. There's only 195 countries, 198 countries, depending on whose list and who's in and who's out that you take. 60 of those, almost 200 countries, are in some kind of open conflict. One estimate says that 1 in 7 people in the world are currently exposed to some kind of armed conflict or political violence. This is a huge thing, not just in the first century. It happened in the first century, but it's been happening ever since, and it's happening more and more and more. Sign number 3, natural disasters. Verse 7, for nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. There will be famines and earthquakes, natural disasters. Acts 11 predicts a great famine. 11:27-30 says, now in those days, prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch, and one of them, named Agabus, stood up and foretold by the Spirit that there would be a great famine all over the world. This took place in the days of Claudius. So the disciples determined, everyone according to his ability, to send relief to the brothers living in Judea. And they did so, sending it to the elders by the hand of Barnabas and Saul. So as early as the book of Acts, which is simply the next couple of chapters of what was God doing right after the close of the Gospels, that's how soon a famine was prophesied and occurred in the days of Claudius. The famine happened in AD about 45 to 70. It's recorded also by Josephus. There was another famine that happened around 66. This was during the Jewish wars. Obviously, when you have zealots burning your fields and your food stores, tends to lead to a kind of famine as well. Earthquakes is another thing that's cited here. Earthquakes were known throughout the region in the early 60s AD. In Laodicea and Pompeii, the 10 cities of the Galilee area, the Decapolis, both the Jewish side and the Gentile side, all show signs of earthquakes. If you get to visit there one day, you'll notice there's one city that sits up on top of the hill overlooking the Jordan Valley, and all of the pillars are knocked one way specifically. It almost looks like it was planned that way. Well, people will tell you that's what happens when there's an earthquake, is the land shears in one particular direction, and it knocked all of the pillars the other way. They fell at the same time. In Philippi, the same thing. The book of Acts records this. Acts 16:26. And suddenly there was a great earthquake, so the foundations of the prison were shaken, and immediately all the doors were open and everyone's bonds were unfastened. So again, even in Bible times, the fulfillment of this prophecy is coming true. In modern times, when we talk about natural disasters, it really depends on who you ask and what their politics are, right? You can take the people who take climate change and everything that comes from climate change and talk about, the impending doom from that. You take people who reject it. Still, there's a lot of things that have happened and will be happening. If you just look at the numbers, though, in the 1980s, there were on average 2 events per year that created $1 billion of damage or more. 1980s, 2 events per year of $1 billion of damage or more. And currently, these are global statistics. Currently, globally, there's about 20 events a year that create $1 billion of damage or more. So when we think about natural disasters, famines, earthquakes, add all of those things together, the number is not just happening, it's also increasing in its speed. Verse 8 of Matthew 24 says, these are the beginnings of the birth pains. All of this is compared to labor. Labor is a common metaphor that's used for the onslaught of the end times, right? It's a human experience that we understand. We understand what it's like to start just being very pregnant, and then to go from being very pregnant to, okay, a baby is coming, and then sometimes that's a long, drawn-out process, but there's also a delivery moment on the horizon. And there's all the signs in between that tell you where exactly are you. And what Jesus is saying is, all of these things are coming, but you're basically still at the house trying to grab your stuff for the hospital at this point. This is not the end. This is the early part of it. These are the beginnings of the birth pains. These are the signs of the beginning of the end. It's not exactly yet. Sign number 4 is persecution. Verse 9, they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death. You will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. In a moment, he's going to talk about internal strife, but persecution is external strife. People from the outside, people who are not part of the Christian community, are going to make war with you simply because you were Christian. In the first century, this began with Jewish persecution. Go to the book of Acts, and it was none other than Paul, at that time Saul, himself, who was leading the Christian persecution, and the persecution against Christians. If you follow through the book of Acts, the people, the Jews who were persecuting Christians and who were making trouble for Paul, they continued all the way to his trial and all the way to his conviction till he was ultimately killed. Romans also persecuted Christians. In AD 54, there's this guy named Nero, and his goal was to kill Christians. He hated them. There was a fire that started in AD 64. Some think that maybe he started the fire on purpose to give him kind of a context to kill his enemies. But he falsely accused Christians and began persecuting them. Tacitus was a first century historian, and he says it this way. He says, before killing the Christians, Nero used some of them to amuse the people. Some were dressed in furs to be killed by dogs. Others were crucified. Still others were set on fire early in the night so that they might illuminate it. Nero opened his own gardens for these shows, and in the circus, he himself became a spectacle. He mingled with the people dressed as a charioteer, or he rode around in his chariot. All of this aroused the mercy of the people against the culprits who deserved an exemplary punishment, for it was clear they were not being destroyed for the common good, but rather to satisfy the cruelty of one person. From this statement from Tacitus, it's clear he does not like the Christians. He hates them too. But he also doesn't think they started the fire, and he's seeing that Nero is just seizing an opportunity to make an example of Christians and to kill them. Pliny the Younger, he was the governor of northern Turkey just a little bit after this, and he wrote at that time the emperor was Trajan. Trajan, he was asking him about instructions of what to do with this problem of Christianity, and Pliny, to his credit, was trying to learn about Christianity. He interviewed a lot of Christians, sometimes torturously interviewed them, but he interviewed them nonetheless. He wanted to understand their beliefs. The only thing he pointed out were some of their kind of unique qualities or their peculiarities. He says, he writes the governor, they met each day before dawn on Sunday to sing to Christ as to a god. They made oaths not to commit theft or adultery or other major sins. And they gathered for a common meal, though they had to stop this when Roman law outlawed secret meetings. But he's asking the question of, he's kind of saying, look, I've learned about their beliefs. Their actual beliefs aren't actually that problematic for Rome. Like, they're not out doing crime. They just have a different belief system. What should we do? And Trajan basically writes back and he says, look, there's not one rule for dealing in every situation, right? You have to use some discernment in how to deal with this. But he says, look, since the nature of their crime, it's not violent, it's not really problematic, let's not waste government resources seeking them out and finding them. However, they are a particularly stubborn people. And so at times when they happen to be in court and you happen to say, hey, will you swear by the Roman gods? And they say no, we can't tolerate their stubbornness. So don't go seek and find them, right? We're not going to hunt them down house to house. But also when you have them in court, if they're not willing to bow the knee to Rome, this is still Rome after all, you should make an example of them. And so that is kind of what he did. Don't seek them out, but if you have them and they refuse you in any way, punish them. By the early 3rd century, Rome's position changed again. So in the early days, it seemed like persecution was trying to kill the Christians. But a few generations later, it changes. It changes to try to make people deny their faith. The emperor at that time, he was trying to unite all of Rome, which at this point was kind of falling apart. They weren't maintaining a central control. And so he says, look, we will allow any religious practice. We will allow anyone to worship any god that they want, so long as we all unite under one thing. Can we all worship, he called it Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. Have your Jesus, have your Apollo, have your all the gods, have all this stuff, but together as Romans, the Roman side of us is we will worship the unconquered sun. There's two groups, obviously this doesn't sit right with the Jews and the Christians who refused this offer to make some kind of sacrifice or some kind of worship to this God. One Roman emperor during this time, he sought to make Christians renounce their faith rather than simply kill them. In killing the Christians, Rome had found out something that Tertullian wrote about. Tertullian was an early church theologian, and he said, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. And at this point, they're realizing every time we kill Christians, they're sharing their testimony. They're like, yes, it creates a spectacle that the crowds like to watch, but also people are moved by their testimony. They're moved by their courage. They're moved by their faith, and they're following too. We're making more Christians. And so they had a different approach. Let's try to make Christians deny their faith rather than simply kill them. So he would arrest Christians and threaten to torture them in all kinds of ways, but he would offer them a way out. He would say, look, if you will perform a sacrifice to this God, we will give you a certificate. And this certificate basically says that you're a loyal subject of Rome, and essentially show that to anyone who disagrees, and this is your get out of jail free card. We won't be a problem for you again as long as you'll do this. Certain Christians saw that as a good offer, right? All I have to do, perform the sacrifice, I get a certificate, and then I can go live my life. Some Christians thought, well, I see a way around this. Let me just create a fake certificate that looks like this one. But then that creates a problem for the church. What do you do if someone denies their faith? Have you ever thought about that? Like, what if someone in here was taken before the court and they say, hey, are you a Christian? And they go, no, I'm not a Christian. No, I don't follow Christ. What do we do next Sunday? Do we welcome them back? Do we say, no, you're not welcome here? See, in the early church, they actually had to settle this out. Early on, Rome was just killing the Christians, so they never had to worry about the problem of what do you do letting someone back in because there was no one to let back in. But as Rome got a little bit smarter in saying, well, let's get them to deny their faith, now you have people who have denied their faith. Can they come back in or not? And so there was actually a pretty big discussion about this in the early days. And essentially, the church started on the side of if you've lapsed in your faith, you're not welcome back. But then over time, that obviously shifted. And they realized, look, if Jesus is willing to forgive people, like he forgave and restored Peter and the other disciples, how can we as the church hold that against them? Early Christians, they were accused of atheism. Believing in one God in a culture that believes in many gods looked like atheism to them. But I think part of what the Romans didn't like is they rejected the state gods. And in rejecting the state gods, you're kind of rejecting the state. It's sort of like being unpatriotic, right? We're Rome, and the gods of Rome protect Rome. And at first, Rome is amazing. It's a great place to be. We're secure, we're safe, we're prosperous. Now we have this other group called Christians in. They worship these other gods. They brought in this religion from the outside, and they refuse the worship of Roman gods. We're also losing some military battles. How do we sort of clean the slate here? How do we make sure that our side is truly our side? If you're not with us, you're against us. And that's one of the reasons why they did this, is not worshiping the state gods started looking like treason before long. In modern times, we live in a world that's actually quite marked by persecution. Sometimes our world as North Americans, we are somewhat oblivious to this. I have a map here, and this is a map of the top 50 countries in the world where persecution happens. Globally, 1 in 7 Christians are persecuted, but in Africa, that's 1 in 5, and in Asia, that's 2 in 5 Christians come under some kind of persecution, whether it's something light like discrimination, can't get a job, can't go to a college, or something heavy like physical violence, jail time, or even death. 4,700 Christians were detained last year by their local governments. 3,600 church properties were attacked in one way or another. Murders of Christians rose to 4,800 people this past year. Of those, 93% of the deaths took place in sub-Saharan Africa. Look at that middle swath of Africa. That's where most of those deaths took place, with almost 3,500 of those deaths being specifically in Nigeria. This is something that happens in our world today. In our last church, we had a lady from Nigeria. Nigeria is kind of divided north to south. In the north, they tend to be more Muslim. That's where you might hear about terrorist groups like Boko Haram operate up there. In the south, they tend to be more Christian. And she's from the border town. She's from a town called Kaduna. And in Kaduna, you have people from both sides. But both sides have access to each other as well. And when she was a young girl, one of these terror groups came through, put a knife to her throat and said, "Do you follow Jesus?" She said, "No." I chatted with this lady a number of times throughout the years that I've known her, and this is something that weighs heavily on her heart. I feel confident if there's ever a person that I know in the real world today that would not deny Christ, I think it's actually her. I think what she feels from that is so great that I don't think she would deny again. But it's a challenge even for the church today. As the church grows and expands and becomes more global, we're going to have deeper connections to people that we will know on a personal level who've experienced some kind of persecution. Sign number 5 is offense and offenders. Verse 10, many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. This is that internal strife. Persecution is external strife. It's the outsiders coming in. But this is people inside of the church, internal strife. Matthew uses a word that has used a bunch of times in here. He uses the word scandalizo, scandalized. In Greek culture, it had the secular meaning like to tie a noose around or to set a trap, to create an offense. In the New Testament, it tends to mean things like taking an offense or falling away from or falling into sin. As a noun, it can mean things like a stumbling block. We talk about the scandal of the cross. That's this word right here. In the first century, in the early church, in the book of Corinth, the church was so internally divided that Paul wrote 4 letters to this church. The early church fathers after this wrote another series of letters to the church at Corinth. In fact, the internal strife was so great, the ways that they were playing it out were so great. In 1 Corinthians 11, Paul says, hey, this is the reason why many of you are falling asleep and are sick. Paul sometimes had people who turned their back from the mission, such as Demas. Demas was one of his fellow co-workers. He was with Paul. He's mentioned in a number of letters in a very positive light. And then in 2 Timothy, this is what Paul says. This is the end of that time. 2 Timothy 4:10 says, for Demas, in love with this present world, has deserted me and gone back to Thessalonica. He's deserted me and gone back. There's internal strife. There's falling away. There's the lure of the world. Tacitus, the Roman historian I quoted from a moment ago, he gives a depiction of Nero's punishment of Christians after that fire. He says, therefore, to quell the rumor, Nero has substituted as culprits and punished with the utmost refinement of cruelty a class of men loathed for their vices, whom the crowds called Christians. Christus, the founder of the name, has undergone the death penalty in the reign of Tiberius by sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate. And the pernicious superstition was checked for a moment, only to break out once more, not merely in Judea, the home of the disease, but in the capital itself, where all things horrible or shameful in the world collect and find a vogue. First then, the confessed members of the sect were arrested. Next, on their disclosure, vast numbers were convicted, not so much on the count of arson as for the hatred of the human race. Here he's describing that same scene of the fire happened, Nero gathered these people and starts punishing them. But there's this little line here, on their disclosure. He captured a group of Christians and pressed them, and they disclosed the location of other Christians. Then vast numbers were convicted. Vast numbers were convicted. They grabbed a few. This few talked about the rest, the many, and then he grabbed the rest of them. This is internal strife. This is the falling away. This is the faith growing cold. In modern times, there's many signs in our own day that people are leaving the faith. There's something sociologists call the rise of the nones, N-O-N-E-S, not Catholic nuns, N-O-N-E-S. And this is like people who don't have any religion of any kind. They're not affiliated with anything. Currently, nuns make up more than Protestant Christians or more than Catholic Christians in the United States. In the Northeast and the Northwest, they're particularly high. Washington State, of all 50 states, we have the highest percentage of nuns out of all of them, roughly 32%. But some of this is a generational thing. The majority of nuns are in Gen Z. Roughly 43% of Gen Z don't affiliate with any kind of religion. Now, this by itself is a certain thing, but much of this growth has happened as a result of people leaving Christianity. There's a direct correlation between people leaving Christianity and the rise of the nuns. Now, it's not a numbers game, right? I'm not trying to have a majority. I don't think we should think in terms of majority or winning. That's not the point. The point is, this is one of the signs of the time, that people will be falling away from the faith, that their hearts will grow cold. When we look at the numbers, we certainly see this. In recent years, there's been a phenomenon of Christians deconstructing their faith. A Barna poll says that roughly 42% of Christians have done this. Now, when we think of deconstructing, I think there's a productive way and a non-productive way to do this. See, faith always happens in a culture. It happens in a context. And so it gets mixed with a culture and context. And this is impossible not to do. It's impossible to have just a sterile Christianity. Christianity always has a culture. In the first century, that culture was Jewish. And as it was Jewish, when you go through Acts, there's actually a debate inside the church of how Jewish does Christianity need to be. If you're following Jesus, do you now have to kind of become fully Jewish to get the whole thing or not? And Paul is on the side of no, absolutely not. The gospel is the gospel. And then there's another side that says, no, better get circumcised, better follow the food laws, better do this, better do that. So even in the first century, there's a debate between those two. But that's not what modern deconstruction is. Modern deconstruction is not saying, well, let me take the cultural elements, the way that we've put too much American individualism, too much American comfort. Let me go back to the basics of the Bible. Let me go back to the foundation, which is Christ, and let me rebuild the house of my faith on those foundations instead of on Jesus will give me the American dream theology. But that 42% haven't done that. For the most part, they've gone down to the foundation and found out that their foundation wasn't Christ in the first place. Sign number 6 is apostasy. Verse 11 says, there'll be many false prophets that will arise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. Go read the rest of the New Testament, and much of it is written to address different kinds of false teachings. Galatians, Colossians, 1 Timothy, 2 Peter, Jude. All of these books are to address very specific heresies and false teachings. If we look at how were the early disciples made, we have the disciple John, right, who followed Jesus. He disciples a man named Polycarp. John was later exiled. Polycarp was later martyred. And Irenaeus was a guy who grew up listening to Polycarp preach. So he's kind of his disciple. And in one of his earliest books that he wrote, one of the earliest Christian books, his title is called Against Heresies. Wonder what that one's about. It's essentially like one of the first theological dictionaries where he lists out heresy by heresy by heresy in the first century and kind of addresses it from a Christian standpoint. In every generation, we've had books like this, including our own generation. There are dozens of books talking about all the various heresies and different groups that are out there. In modern times, there's one verse in the Bible which leads many to make such claims of being a special kind of prophet or a Messiah. I've heard many Muslims use this. I've heard many Mormons use this. There's lesser-known groups like the International Family. David Berg runs that quote this verse. This is from Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 18:15 says, "The Lord will raise up from among your brothers. It is him who you shall listen to, just as you desired from the Lord your God at Horeb, the day of the assembly, when you said, 'Let me not hear again the voice of the Lord or see the great fire anymore, lest I die.'" And he says, "I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brothers, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he will speak to them all that I command him." Right, so this is God speaking to Moses saying, I'm going to raise up one like you. There's going to be a Moses-like character who will come. I will put my words in his mouth. You're supposed to listen to him. Now, read the New Testament and read the Gospels. It's so clearly Jesus. It's so hard to arrive at anything else. And yet, listen to other people and they go, this is the verse that shows that the prophet Muhammad was prophesied in your Bible, right? This is the one that shows that Joseph Smith was prophesied in your Bible. Now, it's interesting. They don't read the full passage in context. The next verse says, "But the prophet who presumes to speak a word in my name that I've not commanded him to speak, or who speaks in the name of other gods, that same prophet shall die. And if you say in your heart, how may we know what the word of the Lord has spoken? When a prophet speaks in the name of the Lord, if the word does not come to pass or come true, that word the Lord has not spoken. The prophet has spoken it presumptuously. You need not be afraid of him." Funny, self-proclaimed prophets don't like to include these verses in their citations. They don't quote the whole passage. Yeah, there is one who's coming after. That's Jesus. But the litmus test for is a prophecy true or not is that right there. If it comes to pass, it was true. And if it doesn't, it's not. Sign number 7 is mission. Verse 14, the gospel of the kingdom, this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Now we have a picture, Revelation gives us a picture of what heaven is going to look like. Revelation 5:9-10 says, "They sang a new song saying, 'Worthy are you to take the scroll and open its seal, for you were slain, and by your blood you ransomed people for God from every tribe and language and people and nation. And you've made them a kingdom of priests to our God, and they shall reign on the earth.' You've taken from every tribe and language and people and nation. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached, and the end will come." And we take Revelation 5:9 and go, okay, God's picture of the world is every language, every tribe, every tongue. The question is, what does that mean? There was a time in Christian mission history where they thought, well, let's get a missionary into every political country, right? And now the world is reached. Well, Jesus hasn't come back yet. Is that how it's going to happen? Some of this actually happened in the first century. Acts traces the early Christian mission, which expanded through the Roman Empire. Church tradition tells us that Thomas made it as far as India. The Christians there say that that's how they came to be. If you study Christianity in China, you realize that the Nestorians came there 1100, 1200, something like that. But when they got there, there were already signs, inscriptions, words, and various things in Chinese culture which showed the gospel had been there. Not necessarily that everyone was Christian or that there were churches, but they had had at least a hearing of what was the message at that point. Paul seems to think in Romans that this has been fulfilled already. Romans 10:18, he says, "But I ask, have they not heard? Indeed they have, for their voice has gone out to all the earth and their words to the ends of the world." So Paul seems to think that in some way this gospel proclamation has reached the ends of the world already. I have a couple of maps here just to show kind of where this is at in modern times. This first one kind of shows all of the people groups of the world. Now, the green dots on this map represent people that have access to the gospel. Okay, this does not mean you look at our country and go, wow, we're not that reached. We're not that reached. But there's access to the gospel. While much of our community does not believe, there are dozens and dozens of churches that proclaim the gospel in our community. There's the Bible in our language in our community. There's podcasts, there's TV shows. There's all of these different things that give people access to the gospel. So you look at those yellow dots or those red dots, these are places where there's not access to the gospel, meaning the gospel is not in their language. There's not a local church there in their language. And so they don't have access to the gospel. There's another map that's a little bit clearer, and these are the unengaged groups. And those dots are kind of weighted. These are dots where these are people groups where there's no current missionary or mission activity going on, right? Not only do they not have access, but no one's even trying yet. Not for a lack of trying. Agencies look at this map. That's where I pulled this map from, was one of the mission agencies. They're trying to promote this so that people will see these dots and go, wait a second, God wants us to take the gospel into all of the world. This is about access to the gospel. So the question is, can global evangelism be used as an end times clock? Actually, you will meet some missionaries who think this. They take the people group maps or the people group listings and they go, well, as long as we reach all of the people groups, what Matthew says is the gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed and then the end will come. Well, first off, there's a difference between every country in the world having access to every people group having access. But even the people group lists, there's one list that has 7,000 or 8,000 people groups listed. There's another group list that has 12 or 13,000 people groups listed. Sometimes new people groups are created as cultures change. Sometimes other ones are taken off as they just become part of a broader culture. Which list is God using? We don't know. Does he have his own people group list? We don't know. Also, it says this will happen and then the end will come, but it's not said immediately. There's no clock set. It's just the gospel will be proclaimed and then this other thing will happen. The gospel has to be proclaimed first. So we don't know, will God wait a long time after the full proclamation to all of the people groups according to his understanding? Will he wait a long time or will it be the exact second? Well, the text doesn't say this. And so I always caution people away from that kind of thinking. We know what we're supposed to do. We know that God wants us to proclaim his name to the ends of the earth, and that is what we should be about. Whether or not we use that for a clock, I don't think it was intended that way. So what does all of this mean for us? Number one, don't be led astray. This is one of the commands. There's only two commands in this whole passage. Number one, don't be led astray. Jesus doesn't want us to be fooled. See to it that no one leads you astray. He doesn't want us to be led astray by the powers of this age. Powers of this age that say, hey, we control the here and now. We control the future. We're the ones calling the shots. You better get in line with us, right? That was Rome's claim. That's a lot of the modern nation's claim. The modern superpowers claim is you better get in line with our agenda because we have the power to hurt you. And Jesus is saying, I don't want you to be led astray. This is not how the world is working. The world is not run by these powers. Very often, these powers simply usher in the next phase of what God was going to do anyway. But they do this unwittingly. It's also so we won't be led astray by Christian leaders, by Christian movements. More than one time in Christian history, you get some charismatic leader that's very hopped up on end times theology and creates all kinds of problems, right? Whole cities have gone into anarchy because of one person trying to do this. And Jesus is saying, you don't need to be fooled by these people. End-time theology also can kind of be the dog whistle of kind of a crossover between Christians and conspiracy theorists. Don't be led astray. There's a big difference between being ignorant of something and being obsessed with it. Yes, Jesus is coming back. And as we go through the passage, he wants us to understand some things about that. But one of the main things by the next chapter he's going to want us to understand is we're supposed to be ready, and we're supposed to be watching, and we're supposed to be waiting. In the meantime, until he comes back, there's work for us to be doing. Number 2, don't be afraid. Verse 6, this is the other command of the passage. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See to it that you are not alarmed. This must take place, but the end is not yet. Fear is a tool of the enemy. Fear is a tool that can manipulate us. Fear is a tool that can silence us. Through most times of Christian persecution, the goal has not been to kill people. The goal of persecution is to silence people. The goal of spiritual warfare is not to physically attack a person. The goal of spiritual warfare is to create dissension so that the movement stops, so that the gospel stops. Fear is a tool of the enemy. And when Christians talk about what is going on in the world, and then we start inducing fear, they're either a victim of Satan themselves, maybe they're a tool of Satan, maybe they're simply ignorant of God's sovereignty. But Jesus says, this is what will happen. You don't need to be alarmed. Finally, faithful endurance. Verse 13 talks about people wandering away, their faith growing cold. We need to be faithful to our own faith. We need to endure to the end. So many times in our world, Christians throw other Christians under the bus, right? We're trying to gain favor with our neighbor, our coworker. Oh, no, I'm not like those Christians over there. I would never believe that stuff. I would never do that stuff. Look, are there some weird Christians in the world? Absolutely. If you don't know any, it's probably you. But so many times we're too quick, right? We see Christian groups doing things in the news and they're loud and aggressive, or they're saying things that we wouldn't say or doing things that we wouldn't do. And it's okay to go, you know what, quietly to myself, like I wouldn't do things that way. But I don't need to throw another person under the bus. I don't need to talk bad about them just because God has done something different in my life or because God has led us in two different ways. Because we're communicating something to the world. We are taking the role of the persecutor when we do that kind of things. Another way that we need faithful endurance is just that word endurance. We don't endure in hard times. COVID taught us a lot about our preparedness. Taught us a lot about how prepared are we as a national church, as a global church, to go into times where our regular Sunday meeting can't happen in the way that we might plan it. It taught us a lot about where were the breakdown points in our chains of discipleship from one person to the next, from one generation to the next. We need that kind of endurance. Remember when it was 2 weeks to flatten the curve? I do too. And then it went 2 months and it just got longer and longer and longer. And at a certain point, people just said, I'm done. There was exhaustion that happened. There were people who stepped away from church during that time. Things like live streaming, which met a need in one moment, in one instant, became now a tool to keep people away from the gathering. I understand there are people who are shut in for medical reasons, for physical reasons, but also the ability now to pick any service you want in the country, almost in the world, and just enjoy this in our pajamas, enjoy this with comfort being our king. It's now a service that the church provides. We don't endure in hard times, and we learned this lesson. But because of this, knowing ourselves in the recent past years, and also looking at what Jesus is saying of this message of get ready, it's going to be hard. we need to get ready. How are we preparing ourselves to faithfully endure to the end? Let me close this in prayer. Jesus, we look forward to your return. We know that you will come, that you will set things right. We know that you will bring justice and truth. You will bring your peace. These are all things that our world needs, that our community needs. But a whole lot is happening, has happened, and is going to happen between then and your coming. God, I pray that we would not be led astray, not by false teachers, not by false messiahs, by false prophets, by false teaching, not by the powers of this world, not by the powers of darkness, not by our own sin nature, but that we would keep our eyes focused on you as the one true Messiah, the one true Lord. But Lord, this idea of faithful endurance, that our hearts wouldn't grow cold, that we wouldn't fall away from the faith, this is something we need your empowerment to do. God, fill us with your Spirit, embolden us. We see the way that before Pentecost, the disciples were frightened, they were hiding. And after your Holy Spirit filled them, they were bold. They were willing to speak out. They were willing to oppose the authorities if necessary, to proclaim your kingdom. They were willing to suffer and even die. God, fill us with your Spirit so that we might be bold as well. We ask this in your name.